In 1892, a photographer named A.W. Erickson captured something that still stops people cold when they see it today. Two men standing on wooden planks jammed into the side of a redwood tree. They're 20 feet off the ground, balanced on boards no wider than your forearm. Between them stretches a saw that's longer than most men are tall, and behind them, rising into the fog like a column holding up the sky itself, is 17 feet of solid heartwood. That tree started growing when Henry VIII was still married to his first wife. It had survived 4 centuries of lightning strikes, forest fires, and floods. It had watched the Spanish explore the California coast, witnessed the gold rush tear through the Sierra foothills, and stood silent as the Civil War split the nation in half. And these two men, eyes with nothing but sharpened steel and their own sweat, were about to bring it down. Chainsaws didn't exist yet. Neither did hydraulic equipment, cranes, diesel engines, or safety harnesses. Just human beings, simple tools, and trees so massive that a single trunk could fill 15 railroad cars. This is the story of how America's loggers cut down the oldest, largest living things on Earth, using nothing but axes, handsaws, and a knowledge of physics that most engineers today couldn't replicate. It's a story of impossible physical labor, ingenious technique, and a kind of destruction so total that we're still counting the cost more than a century later. But before we can understand how they cut these trees, you need to understand what they were cutting. The coast redwood, Sequoia sempervirens, is not just a large tree. It's the tallest living organism ever documented on this planet. In the old growth forests of Northern California, these trees routinely reached heights of 300 feet or more. Some topped 350 feet, taller than the Statue of Liberty standing on top of itself. Their trunks at the base could measure 30 feet across, wide enough to drive a horse and carriage through without touching the sides. To understand the scale, stand in a parking lot and look at the lines marking individual spaces. A standard parking space is about 9 feet wide. Now imagine a tree trunk that covers 3.5 of those spaces. That's what these men were cutting into. But height and width only tell part of the story. What made redwoods valuable to the timber industry wasn't just their size. It was what that size represented in board feet of usable lumber. A single old-growth redwood could yield over 400,000 board feet of lumber. To put that in perspective, the average American home built in 1900 required about 10,000 board feet of lumber. One redwood could build 40 houses. One tree, 40 homes. Some of the largest redwoods ever documented, trees with names like the Lindsay Creek tree that fell in a storm in 1905, contained enough wood to build 50 or 60 houses. And the wood itself was remarkable. Redwood heartwood contains tannins that make it naturally resistant to rot, insects, and fire. A redwood fence post could last 50 years in the ground without treatment. Redwood shingles could endure Pacific storms for decades. Redwood water tanks didn't rot, didn't taint the water. I didn't need the constant maintenance that oak or pine demanded. The grain was straight and true, free of the knots that weaken pine lumber. The color ranged from pale pink sapwood to deep burgundy heartwood that aged to a silver gray. Architects loved it. Builders trusted it. Homeowners demanded it. For a nation that was building cities faster than it could cut lumber, redwood wasn't just valuable, it was essential. San Francisco alone consumed millions of board feet per year as it expanded from a gold rush camp to a major metropolis. But here's what the timber companies faced when they looked at these trees. The very qualities that made redwoods valuable made them almost impossible to harvest. The bark alone could be 12 inches thick, soft and fibrous, deadening every axe blow like a sponge absorbing a punch. The sapwood beneath was stringy and tough, and the heartwood, that prized rot-resistant core, was so dense that a misaligned cut would bind your saw tight as a vise, and redwoods grew in places that seemed designed to kill anyone who tried to work there. The Coast Range of Northern California is a maze of steep canyons, unstable slopes, and seasonal creeks that turned into rivers during winter storms. The forest floor was buried under ferns and fallen debris that could hide holes deep enough to swallow a man to his waist. The fog that kept the redwoods alive also kept the forest floor perpetually damp, slippery with moss, treacherous underfoot. The men who figured out how to bring these giants down didn't learn their trade in any school. They developed it through trial, error, and a body count that nobody bothered to record. Let's talk about the tools, because when you're cutting a tree that weighs more than 1,000 tons, the margin for error isn't just small, it's measured in the difference between walking away and getting buried. The primary cutting tool was the crosscut saw, not the chainsaw that wouldn't be invented for another 50 years, not even the powered bandsaws that worked in sawmills. A crosscut saw was nothing more than a long, flexible blade with teeth cut into both edges, pulled back and forth by two men working in rhythm. But these weren't ordinary crosscut saws. The saws used on old-growth redwoods range from 12 to 16 feet long. Some monster saws stretched to 20 feet, though those were rare because finding two men who could coordinate that much steel without binding it was nearly impossible. The weight of these saws varied, but a typical 16-footer weighed between 50 and 60 pounds. That's the weight of a large dog, stretched across 16 feet of tempered steel, with teeth that needed resharpening every few hours of use. The blades were made by specialty manufacturers, companies like Simons and Diston that understood the specific demands of West Coast timber. The steel had to be hard enough to hold an edge through dense heartwood, but flexible enough to bend without breaking when the saw twisted in the cut. Too hard and it shattered. Too soft and it dulled within minutes. The metallurgy was precise, and good saws were expensive, but the crosscut saw had a secret that made it work. The teeth weren't uniform. A properly filed crosscut had two types of teeth working in sequence. The outer teeth, called cutters, were filed to a sharp point and bent slightly outward in alternating directions. These scored the wood fibers on both sides of the cut, essentially creating two parallel grooves. The inner teeth, called rakers, were filed flat across the top and set slightly shorter than the cutters. These raked out the scored wood fibers like tiny chisels, clearing the kerf so the saw could advance. The pattern repeated along the entire length of the blade. Cutter, cutter, raker, cutter, cutter, raker. Sometimes the pattern was cutter, raker, cutter, raker. It depended on the wood species, the tooth size, the preferences of the filer. Every logging camp employed at least one saw filer, a man whose sole job was maintaining the saws. He'd spend 12 hours a day at a filing bench, resetting bent teeth, resharpening dulled cutters, on adjusting the depth of rakers that had worn down from use. A good filer could feel the difference between a properly set tooth and one that was 1/100th of an inch too far out. His work was invisible until a saw started binding, and then it was obvious who had been careless. A poorly maintained saw would bind, buck, or simply refuse to cut. A properly maintained saw in the hands of experienced fallers could move through redwood heartwood at a rate of about 1 inch per stroke. Sounds slow until you remember that each stroke moved 4 feet of steel through the cut. In a perfect world, with perfect sharpening, two good fallers could cut 1 inch per second. Reality was rarely perfect. But the crosscut saw was only part of the equation. Before the saw could even touch the tree, the fallers had to deal with that 12 inches of bark. This is where the axe came in, not a splitting maul or a camp hatchet, a falling axe with a head weighing between 3 and 4 pounds, mounted on a helve, that's the handle, of 30 to 36 inches. The geometry of a falling axe was different from a splitting axe. The bit was narrower, ground to a thinner edge, designed to slice across wood grain rather than split along it. The handle itself was usually made from hickory, shipped out from the eastern states where hickory trees grew. West Coast woods like ash and oak weren't as resilient to the constant vibration of chopping. A faller might wear through 2 or 3 handles per month, splintered or cracked from the relentless impact. Stripping bark off a 30-foot circumference tree with a 4-pound axe wasn't something you did in an afternoon. Teams of bark peelers would work their way around the trunk, chopping through that fibrous outer layer until they exposed the white sapwood beneath. A big redwood might take a full day just to prepare for cutting. Some of the largest trees took 2 days of peeling before the saws could even start. Then came the wedges: steel wedges, iron wedges, wooden wedges made from Pacific madrone or tan oak. These weren't optional accessories. They were the difference between controlling the fall and watching 1,000 tons of wood sit down on your saw, pinching the blade so tight that no amount of pulling would ever free it. A falling crew carried dozens of wedges in different sizes. Some were thin starting wedges driven in to open the kerf. That's the cut itself, just enough to keep the saw moving freely. Others were thick falling wedges, are designed to force the tree's weight in the direction you wanted it to go. The heaviest wedges weighed over 10 pounds each, driven with 8-pound sledgehammers until the steel mushroomed flat at the top. The wooden wedges were used when you needed to get serious about direction. Steel could slip out of a greasy kerf, but wood against wood gripped tight. A good falling wedge made from tan oak could take enormous punishment before splitting, and when it did split, it didn't fly apart the way a metal wedge might ricochet. Sledgehammers came in various weights. The standard falling hammer was 8 pounds, enough to drive a wedge deep without exhausting the man swinging it. But some crews used 12-pound hammers for the final drive, the strokes that would tip the tree past the point of no return. And then there were the springboards. Because here's something about old-growth redwoods that created an entirely unique problem. The base of the tree, that massive root flare where the trunk meets the ground, could extend outward 15 or 20 feet in every direction. And this wood, the butt swell, was worthless. The fibers at the base of a redwood were twisted, gnarled, and grain-crossed from centuries of supporting that immense weight. Sawmills couldn't use it. It was prone to checking and splitting as it dried. The labor required to cut through it wasn't worth the low-grade lumber it produced. So the fallers didn't cut at ground level. They cut above the butt swell, sometimes 10 feet up, sometimes 20 feet up, wherever the trunk straightened out and the grain ran true. This meant leaving enormous stumps behind, but the economics were clear. I should better to abandon 500 board feet of worthless buttwood than spend 2 extra days cutting through it. But how do you make a horizontal cut in a tree trunk when you're standing 20 feet off the ground? There were no bucket trucks, no scaffolding, no hydraulic lifts. The answer was the springboard, a plank of Douglas fir about 4 feet long and 6 inches wide, with a steel shod tip on one end. The faller would chop a pocket into the bark and sapwood, angling slightly upward. Then he'd jam the springboard into that pocket, steel tip biting into solid wood, until the board stuck out perpendicular to the trunk, and then he'd step onto it. Picture this. You're 20 feet off the ground, standing on a plank no wider than a balance beam, with nothing beneath you but air and fern-covered forest floor. Your partner is on an identical board 6 feet to your right. Between you stretches 14 feet of cross-cut saw. Behind you is the trunk of a tree so massive that you can't see around it. You pull. He pulls. The saw moves. Sawdust falls. For hours. The fallers developed a rhythm that became almost hypnotic. Pull, release, pull, release. The saw singing through the wood with a high-pitched whine that could be heard a quarter mile away. Good partners barely spoke during the cut. They communicated through the saw itself, feeling when the other man was tiring, adjusting their stroke to compensate. And they worked balanced on those springboards, shifting their weight with every pull, learning to anticipate the bounce and flex of the Douglas fir planks beneath their caulked boots. The caulks were steel spikes screwed into the soles, unnecessary for grip on bark and damp wood. Without caulks, you'd slip off the springboard within minutes. The undercut came first. This was the mouth, the notch that would determine where the tree fell. A good undercut had 2 components. First, the faller chopped a horizontal kerf with his axe, cutting into the tree about 1/3 of the trunk's diameter. On a 15-foot diameter tree, that meant cutting 5 feet into solid wood. Then he made a second cut, angling down from above to meet the first cut, removing a wedge of wood shaped like a slice of pie. This wasn't rough carpentry. The angle of the undercut mattered precisely. Too shallow and the tree wouldn't fall cleanly. Too steep and you wasted wood. The standard angle was between 30 and 45 degrees, adjusted based on the tree's lean and the desired fall direction. The direction this notch faced was the direction the tree would fall. get it wrong, and 1,000 tons of wood would go somewhere you didn't intend. Maybe onto the donkey engine that cost more than most loggers earned in 5 years. Maybe onto the skid road that represented weeks of construction labor. Maybe onto the men working below who trusted your judgment with their lives. Experienced fallers could read a tree the way a pilot reads weather. They noted the lean, where the weight of the crown pulled the trunk off vertical. Even a few degrees of lean represented tons of force that would affect the fall. They studied the wind, knowing that a coastal breeze through the canopy could add tons of force in unexpected directions. An afternoon wind that picked up during the fall could push a tree 20 feet off its intended line. They looked for widowmakers, those dead branches trapped in the crown that could shake loose during the fall and drop straight down onto anyone below. A branch that weighed 300 pounds falling from 200 feet hit the ground with the force of a small bomb. Loggers died from widowmakers more often than from the trees themselves. They examined the root structure, looking for signs of rot or damage that might cause the tree to behave unpredictably. A root ball weakened by fungus could release suddenly, dropping the tree straight down instead of pivoting on its stump. They looked at neighboring trees, calculating whether the falling giant might strike another trunk and glance off in an unexpected direction. One wrong calculation, and the tree would barber chair. That's when the trunk splits vertically during the fall, the back half kicking outward with enough force to launch a man 100 feet through the air. The term came from the way the split trunk resembled a barber's chair tilting back, but there was nothing amusing about it. Barber chair kills were usually instant, or the tree could fall against another tree, lodge itself between branches, and become what loggers called a schoolmarm, hung up at an angle, unpredictable, ready to break free without warning. A hung tree was sometimes more dangerous than a standing one because you couldn't predict when it would release. Men were crushed days after a tree lodged, killed by their own earlier work. Once the undercut was complete, the fallers moved to the back cut. They'd switch positions, resetting their springboards on the opposite side of the trunk. Then the real work began. The back cut started about 2 inches above the floor of the undercut. This wasn't sloppiness. That 2-inch step created what's called the holding wood, a hinge of uncut timber that would control the fall as the tree tipped forward. Cut straight through without that hinge, and the tree could kick back, the butt of the log swinging toward the fallers with enough mass to flatten a locomotive. The holding wood was where physics met faith. Too much holding wood and the tree wouldn't fall. Just stand there groaning as the wedges drove in deeper. Too little, and the tree could break unpredictably, twisting as it fell. The right amount depended on the wood's strength, the tree's weight, the lean, the wind. Experienced fallers developed an instinct for it, but even experienced fallers sometimes got it wrong. So they sawed, stroke after stroke, an hour after hour. 2 men pulling a 14-foot blade through wood so dense that a cubic foot of it weighed over 30 pounds. The sawdust piled up beneath them, fragrant with the distinctive cinnamon smell of redwood resin. The dust coated everything, their clothes, their faces, the inside of their lungs. They couldn't see into the cut. They couldn't know exactly how much wood remained between their saw and the undercut on the opposite side. They worked by feel, by sound, by the subtle changes in how the tree moved around them. Because the tree did move. As the back cut deepened, the weight of the crown, all those thousands of pounds of branches and foliage, began to shift. The trunk would groan, a sound like nothing you've heard unless you've stood close to a dying giant. Wood fibers tearing, sap popping. The accumulated stress of 400 years suddenly releasing. Sometimes the tree would settle backward, pinching the saw. That's when the wedges became critical. The falling crew would drive steel into the back cut, forcing the kerf open, relieving the pressure on the blade. Other times the tree would start to lean forward too soon, the holding wood cracking before the cut was complete. Then you ran, and you hoped you ran fast enough. And then the falling wedges in earnest. The man with the sledge would drive steel into the back cut, forcing the kerf wider, tilting the weight forward. 1 wedge, 2, 5, 10. Each blow of the hammer adding pounds of force to the lean, tons of pressure against that narrowing strip of holding wood. Meanwhile, the saw kept moving when it could. cutting toward that critical hinge. Listening for the sound every faller knew meant it was time to run. The crack, not a snap, not a pop, a crack like the world breaking. The holding wood, those few inches of timber that were supposed to control everything, couldn't hold anymore. The tree began to move, at first so slowly that you might not even notice, a slight lean that could be your imagination. But redwoods didn't fall like other trees. They didn't tip and pivot in a simple arc. They rose. The butt of the log would actually lift off the stump as the crown swung forward, the entire trunk pivoting around the holding wood like the world's largest seesaw. For one surreal moment, the base of the tree would hang in the air, suspended above the springboards where men had been standing seconds before. That's why fallers ran uphill when they fled. I'm to get out of the path of that rising butt. And then gravity took over completely. A falling old-growth redwood built speed faster than your brain could process. In the first second, it was barely moving, perhaps 5 or 10 degrees off vertical. In the second second, it was a freight train, the crown slicing through the air with an audible whoosh. By the third second, when the crown smashed into the earth, the trunk was traveling at over 60 miles per hour. The impact was violent beyond description. A tree weighing 1,000 tons hitting the ground didn't just fall. It exploded. Branches the size of ordinary trees shattered into splinters that flew hundreds of feet. The crown, that massive canopy that had filtered sunlight for 4 centuries, compressed into a tangle of debris that could bury a house. The trunk itself would often shatter into sections, the impact stress-fracturing heartwood that had been solid since the time of the Reformation. A single redwood might break into a dozen pieces, each break representing thousands of dollars of lost lumber. The best fallers prided themselves on drops that kept the trunk intact, falling onto prepared beds of brush and debris that cushioned the impact. And the earth moved. Literally. Old-growth fallers reported that the ground shook like an earthquake when a big redwood came down. Men working a quarter-mile away could feel the impact through their boots. Windows rattled in logging camp buildings half a mile distant. The sound was something loggers carried with them for the rest of their lives. A roar that started as a whisper of air through the crown and built to a thunder that drowned out everything, followed by a crash that seemed to echo forever in the canyons and gulches of the Coast Range. Then a secondary crash as broken branches rained down, then smaller crashes as widowmakers finally shook loose from their perches in neighboring trees, and then silence, the silence of something that had been alive longer than any nation on earth, now dead, the silence of a hole in the forest canopy that wouldn't fill for another 400 years. The silence of men standing at a distance, breathing hard, waiting to see if anything else would fall. But the fallers didn't have time for silence. Another tree was waiting. The wedges needed collecting. The saws needed filing. And the timber beasts, and that's what they called the men who did this work, had quotas to meet. Let me tell you about the men. They came from everywhere. Scandinavians who'd grown up in the timber traditions of Sweden and Norway, where forests were family businesses passed down through generations. Scots and Irish who'd worked the forests of their home countries before the trees ran out. Americans from Maine and Michigan who followed the timber frontier west when the eastern white pine and hardwood forests fell to the same saws their grandfathers had wielded. Portuguese from the Azores worked the camps in surprising numbers, drawn by the wages and the community of fellow immigrants. Germans, Italians, Finns, men from every nation that had known the weight of an axe and the rhythm of a saw. And they brought their traditions with them and adapted them to trees unlike anything their ancestors had ever seen. They worked in camps that ranged from crude collections of tents to elaborate settlements with bunkhouses, cookhouses, and company stores. The largest operations employed hundreds of men, each with a specific role in the process of turning standing trees into shipped lumber. The fallers were the aristocracy of the camps. They earned more than anyone except the foreman because their skills took years to develop and couldn't be taught from a book. A greenhorn might spend 5 years carrying tools and watching before he was trusted with a saw of his own. And even then, he'd work with an experienced partner who could correct his mistakes before they became fatal. A good faller could read a tree, gauge its lean, predict the pull of the wind, and place his cut so precisely that a redwood would fall within feet of his intended target. The best fallers could drop a tree onto a stake driven into the ground 200 feet away, hitting it squarely. This wasn't showing off. Precise falls meant less damage to the trunk, less danger to other workers, less time wasted clearing unexpected debris. But even the best fallers died. Widowmakers dropped without warning. Trees, barbered shared, without apparent cause. A saw would bind at exactly the wrong moment, trapping a man on his springboard as the tree began to move. The forest didn't care about skill or experience, it just killed. And the camps counted their dead, and the work continued. Below the fallers in the hierarchy came the buckers. These men worked on the fallen logs, cutting them into manageable sections that could be moved out of the forest. A single redwood trunk might need to be bucked into 6 or 8 sections, each one still weighing dozens of tons. Bucking was different from falling. You weren't trying to direct the fall because the tree had already fallen, but you were working on unstable ground, often at odd angles, with logs that could shift without warning. A bucker would cut partway through a log, then realize the weight was settling onto his saw. If he didn't get the wedges in fast enough, he'd lose the saw entirely, pinched so tight that it would take another crew half a day to cut it free. Buckers also faced a different physical challenge. They worked bent over, sawing horizontally through logs resting on the ground. The position destroyed backs. Men who bucked for a decade walked stooped for the rest of their lives, their spines curved permanently from years of hunching over prone timber. Then came the peelers, stripping bark from the buck sections so the logs would slide more easily. Then the choker setters, wrapping steel cables around each section. Then the whistle punks, signaling the donkey operators when to start the steam engines that would drag those sections out of the forest. Every job was dangerous, but the job that killed more men than any other wasn't falling or bucking or choking. It was riding the logs out. Before the invention of the steam donkey, logs were moved by bull teams. 8, 10, sometimes 16 oxen would be hitched to a single log, dragging it along a skid road. That's a path greased with rendered beef fat so the logs would slide more easily. The bull puncher walked beside his team, guiding them with a combination of voice commands and a long pole called a goad. But logs don't roll predictably. They hit obstacles, shift sideways, bounce over grease skids. A log that shifted 6 inches could crush a man's leg. A log that rolled could kill an entire team. When steam donkeys replaced bull teams in the 1880s, the killing didn't stop. It just changed character. Now the logs were dragged by steel cables wound around massive drums, powered by boilers that could explode if the water level dropped too low. Chokers broke under strain. Cables snapped, whipping back through the forest, with enough force to cut a man in half at the waist. They called the broken cables widowmakers, too. Everything in the woods made widows. No one kept accurate records of how many men died in the redwood forests. The timber companies had no incentive to track deaths that might suggest negligence or poor conditions. The men themselves were often transient, known only by nicknames with no families to report their absence. But the estimates are staggering. Logging was, pound for pound, the deadliest occupation in American history. In some years, more than 1 in every 100 loggers died on the job. Others were maimed for life. Crushed hands, severed limbs, backs broken by falling debris. Men in their 20s walked out of the forest with the bodies of old men, broken by a decade of labor that no human body was designed to endure. And yet they kept coming. Because the money was good by the standards of the time, $3 to $5 per day when factory workers earned one. Because the work was available when other industries had collapsed in periodic depressions. Because some men simply couldn't imagine doing anything else. Couldn't picture a life that didn't involve the sound of steel on wood and the smell of sawdust and resin. Now let me tell you about the scale of what they accomplished, because the numbers are almost impossible to process. When American loggers first arrived in the California Coast Range in the 1850s, an estimated 2 million acres of old-growth redwood forest stood along the fog belt from Big Sur to the Oregon border. Some researchers think the actual number was higher, perhaps 2.2 million acres. The forest extended inland only as far as the fog reached, rarely more than 30 miles from the ocean. But along that narrow band, the trees were so dense that sunlight never reached the ground in some groves. By 1900, half of that was gone. By 1920, 3/4 had fallen to the saw. By 1960, when chainsaws had finally replaced crosscuts and diesel tractors had replaced steam donkeys, less than 5% of the original old growth remained standing. 100,000 acres from an original 2 million. And much of that remnant survived only because it grew in canyons too steep to log economically. Think about what that means in terms of individual trees. The average old-growth redwood acre contained between 50 and 100 trees large enough to be commercially valuable. Some particularly dense stands held more. Let's be conservative and say 60 trees per acre. On 2 million acres times 60 trees equals 120 million redwoods. At least 100 million of them, trees that had been growing since before Columbus sailed, were cut down in a single century. And most of them were cut by hand. The chainsaw didn't become practical for timber work until the 1940s. And even then, it took years to develop saws powerful enough for old growth. The vast majority of California's old-growth redwoods, more than 95% of what we lost, fell to crosscut saws pulled by human arms. Each of those trees represented days of labor. Bark peeling, undercuts, backcuts, bucking, peeling, chokering, skidding. A single large redwood might require a week of work from a falling team and a bucking team combined. Multiply that by tens of millions of trees over 50 years. The scale of coordinated human effort is staggering. And what happened to all that wood? It built San Francisco, not once, but twice, because the city burned in 1906 and was rebuilt largely with redwood lumber that wouldn't burn as easily as pine. Redwood framed houses from Portland to San Diego. Redwood shingles covered roofs throughout the West. Redwood pipes carried water to growing cities. Redwood tanks stored it. Redwood railroad ties carried the trains that hauled more redwood lumber to waiting ships. The wood went to China, to Australia, to South America. It went to Hawaii for plantation houses, and to Alaska for salmon processing facilities. It went everywhere that people needed lumber that wouldn't rot, and for 50 years, the supply seemed endless. It wasn't. By the 1920s, the easily accessible groves were gone. And the timber companies pushed deeper into the canyons, built longer railroad lines, deployed bigger steam donkeys. But the economics were changing. Second-growth timber was coming of age in the cut-over lands. And while it wasn't as valuable as old growth, it was cheaper to harvest. The old growth fallers, those men who had spent their lives learning how to bring down trees that were growing when their great-great-grandfathers were born, found their skills becoming obsolete. Chainsaws were lighter, faster, more productive. One man with a chainsaw could outproduce 2 men with a crosscut. The last old growth falling crews worked into the 1970s, cutting the final scattered giants that had somehow escaped earlier harvest. Some of these trees were in canyons so steep that building skid roads cost more than the timber was worth. Others were protected by new regulations or purchased by conservation groups. Today, roughly 120,000 acres of old-growth coast redwood remain standing. That's a number worth sitting with. Of the original 2 million acres, 6% survives. And much of that 6% exists only because it was in places too difficult to reach, or because people finally decided that some things shouldn't be cut down, even if they could be. The men who did this work are gone now. The last of the crosscut fallers died decades ago. Their skills died with them. You could find the tools in museums, read the techniques in logging manuals, but you couldn't find anyone alive who had actually felt a springboard bounce beneath their boots while they pulled a 16-foot saw through heartwood that had been growing since Elizabeth I sat on the English throne. We owe them something, those men. Not gratitude exactly, because what they did destroyed something that can never be replaced. The old growth that fell won't return for another 1,000 years, if it ever returns at all. The ecosystem they shattered, that complex web of species that depended on trees so large that a single trunk could support its own community of plants and animals, that ecosystem is functionally extinct. But we owe them recognition. Recognition that they did something extraordinary, even if that extraordinary thing was terrible. They brought down the largest living things on Earth using nothing but sharpened steel and human muscle. They worked in conditions that would be illegal today, facing dangers that we wouldn't impose on prisoners. They died by the hundreds, and the ones who lived were broken by their 30s. And none of them got rich, and most of them didn't even get remembered. The redwood stumps are still there. If you walk through the second-growth forests of Humboldt or Mendocino County, you'll find them scattered through the woods like ancient ruins. Circles of wood 10 or 15 feet across, slowly rotting back into the soil. Sometimes you can still see the notches where springboards were inserted, rectangular pockets cut into wood that has somehow resisted decay for more than a century. Stand on one of those stumps and look up. The trees surrounding you are third growth, maybe fourth growth, planted after the old growth fell and harvested repeatedly since then. They're tall by normal standards, 80 or 90 feet, healthy and green, but they're children. The stumps you're standing on came from trees that were teenagers when those children's ancestors were seedlings. The scale is incomprehensible, the loss is permanent, and the men who cut them did it without engines, without electricity, without any of the technology we consider essential to major industrial work. They did it with axes that needed sharpening every hour, and saws that needed filing every few hours, and bodies that needed rest they never got enough of. That's the story of how America cut down 400-year-old redwoods before chainsaws existed. It's a story of ingenuity and destruction, of skill and slaughter, of labor so brutal that we can barely imagine it today. It's a story of what human beings can accomplish when they decide that something needs to be done, regardless of the cost. The redwoods have never recovered. The men have never been honored. The tools hang in museums next to photographs of grinning loggers standing beside stumps so wide that the camera couldn't capture the whole scene. And somewhere in the Coast Range fog belt, a redwood seed is germinating in soil made rich by its ancestors' decay. It will grow slowly, an inch or two a year. In 4 centuries, if nothing disturbs it, it might reach the size of the trees that fell when men on springboards decided that nothing was too big to bring down. By then, the men with crosscuts will be less than legend. Their names were never recorded. Their graves were never marked. The only proof they existed is the absence of the forests they destroyed, and the wood that built the cities that forgot them. That's the inheritance. That's the debt. Whether we can ever repay it is a question that doesn't have an answer yet. If you want to see what else American industry accomplished before the machines arrived, click the video on screen. I break down another impossible feat that was done entirely by human hands. Subscribe if you made it this far. I cover the forgotten labor that built this country, and the people who were broken doing it.